So now with routing set up, let's start working on the actual components. And there I want to start with the users component. The users component is not where we sign up, but where even if we're not logged in, we can see a list of users and how many places they shared. It's this list of users page here at the very top of our plan we created. So therefore here in the users component, the goal is to output a list of users, you could say. So I will create a new component here already because splitting is always good. And in that new component, in the user folder, in the components folder, I want to output my list of users. So I will name the component UsersList.js is the file name. We will also need some styling, so I'll add UsersList.css here as well. And I also want to have a separate component for every item in that list. So I'll have a user item.js file as well as a user item CSS file. Now, as always, how you exactly split and structure your code is always up to you. There isn't a single best way, there isn't a single right way. But having a granular structure where every component is relatively small and focused is rarely a bad idea, and is therefore what I will do here. So in UsersList.js, I'll set up a default component by importing React from React so that we can use JSX. Then we have UsersList here, and we will get some props here because we will get the list of users from outside later, so from the parent component. And then I will export this. And I will copy this into user item and just rename UsersList here to user item, both here and then the export. And other than that, it's the same. I will also import the CSS files. So here I import user item.css, and in the user list, in the users list.js file, I will import users list.css so that we have the style files imported as well. Now in the users list component here, my idea is to output either a message of no users found if we have no users in the app yet, if we just launched, or most of the time when we do have at least one user, a list of our users. So there are two possible branches of JSX code I want to return. And that in the end will depend on some data which I expect to get from outside via props, so which I expect to get from the parent component. So here we can add an if check and say if props items, I expect to get an items property. The name is up to you. You just then later have to use it on your users list component when you use it in JSX as well. So here I'll go with items as a name for this prop. If the length of that, because I expect items to be an array and hence it should have a length property, if length is equal to 0, which means we have no users yet, I want to return a div with a class name of center, which is a class name I defined here in index CSS. It just centers the content. And in there, I want to output a h2 tag where I say no users found. So that's my first possibility. Alternatively, if we don't make it in here, and that's not the JSX code we return in this component therefore, so if we do have at least one user, we will return something else. We'll return an unordered list, and in that unordered list, I want to map my items, which is an array of objects, not an array of JSX, but an array of vanilla JavaScript objects into an array of JSX elements. So here we can use the curly braces to output a JavaScript expression, or to be precise, the result of that expression in JSX code. And here I want to go through my items, which I get on my props, and map every item into a JSX element so that this can be rendered as JSX here. So every item here will be a user, of course. You can name this however you want, but it will be a user, so that name makes sense, I guess. And I will return a single user item for every user. So I will import that other component, import user item from /user item, so from that other file here, and return user item as a self-closing JSX element. By the way, here we can also shorten this, get rid of the curly brace and of the return statement, and take advantage of the shorter arrow function syntax, which looks like this. Now every user item needs to get that special key property, which we don't need to handle inside of the user item, but which React needs to manage lists efficiently. And there I expect every user to have an ID. I can't expect all of that because we are the one writing this application code, so it's our duty to provide the right data later. I also want to forward the ID of a user on a separate prop to the user item though. And I also will pass in an image, which we can output. User.image, let's say, has that image data. And the name of the user, which I expect to get on user.name. I also want to output the count, the number of places this user has created. And hence I will pass a place count property to user item and forward user.places. I expect places to be a property on the user object that holds the number of places, not the other place data, just the number of places this user created. So that's a lot of I want to. Right now, nothing of that will happen because all we have at the moment is a simple user item that receives a bunch of data and doesn't do anything with that. And even worse, all our logic is based on the assumption that we get an items prop in the users list, and that's also not the case. So before we work on the user item and the styling, let's make sure we do pass in the items prop to the users list, and that what we pass in as a value is an array of users where every user has the data we're trying to extract down there. Now the question is, where should this be passed in? Well, in our users page. That is where I want to use that users list in the end. So here I will import users list from, and now let's go up one level to be back in the user folder, and then into components, and then here it's users list which I want to import. And then here I will return users list in the end. So my page is very simple because I outsourced the rendering of the list into a separate component. And that's a default approach in React to keep your components lean. Only do very few things in every component on its own. Instead, then delegate tasks to other components. In this case, delegate the rendering of the list of users to the user list component. So now users list requires an items prop because that is what we try to extract in there, right here, props items and props items. And that should be an array. What we pass in as a value should be an array. So here in my component, I will create a users constant, and that is written in all caps because it's kind of a dummy constant. Later in the course, we will fetch our users from our backend, from our Node Express application, but at the moment we have no such backend, so I will work with dummy data for the moment. So here, users is an array of objects. And now every object will represent a user, and since we try to extract some data from every user, we should make sure that this data is all provided. Specifically, every user needs to have an ID, an image, a name, and places. Later, of course, a user will also have an email and password, but on this component, we're not interested in that, so here we will never extract that data from a user. So here it's okay if a user has an ID, let's say U1, has a name, up to you, let's say Max Schwarz, has an image property, and here I just picked a random image URL from the web because right now we have no image upload in our application, so we'll have to pick some URL of some person somewhere in the web. And last but not least, every person also needs a places property, and here I'll set this to 3, any arbitrary number of your choice. Now it's that users array which I'll pass to items, and then I will reformat this with a shortcut, and this is what we got. So I got one user here with 3 places, and I forward that array of that one user to users list. Now in users list, we then output our user items, and in user item, nothing happens. So time to let something happen there in the next lecture.